A 33% move in your company's stock can double the value of your options. Many executives don't realize that until after they've already exercised. Here's what makes non-qualified stock options different from almost every other piece of executive compensation you might have. Nothing happens automatically. Your RSUs vest on a date someone else picked. Your bonus shows up in a paycheck. Your options just sit there, waiting for you to decide when to pull the trigger. That flexibility is a feature. It's also where most of the mistakes happen, because without a deadline forcing your hand, it's very easy to drift into a corner where the decision ends up getting made for you by a calendar, a job change, or a stock market price move you didn't see coming. I'm Klemm. I'm the founder of Inflection Point Wealth Management. This is video 2 in our informational series on executive compensation. Last video, we talked through RSUs. This one is about non-qualified stock options, or NSOs, which are the option instrument you'll find at many publicly traded companies. Same framework as before. What is it? Where does it go wrong? And what do you actually do about it? If NSOs are relevant to you, be sure to click below and subscribe so that you see the rest of our executive compensation series. So an NSO is a right to buy a set number of shares of company stock at a set price within a set period of time. 4 numbers define it. The stock price, sometimes called the exercise price, which is what you'll pay per share if you exercise. The grant size, which is the number of shares you're allowed to buy. The vesting schedule, which tells you when each tranche becomes eligible to exercise. And the expiration, typically 10 years from grant, which is when the option disappears if you haven't used it. Most companies use a 3 or 4 year gradual vesting schedule, meaning this grant releases a portion at a time across that period rather than all at once. When the company grants you options, the stock price is required by tax law to be set at the fair market value of the stock on the grant date. So at the moment of the grant, there's no built-in profit. Exercising that day would cost you exactly what the stock is worth. The value comes from time and appreciation. On the grant date, nothing happens tax-wise. No tax at vest either. The tax event is the exercise. When you exercise, the spread, the fair market value on the exercise minus your strike price, is treated as ordinary income. It shows up on your W-2 in the year you exercise. Federal income tax and FICA apply. The federal supplemental withholding rate is 22% up to $1 million of supplemental wages in the calendar year, and 37% above that. Now here's a detail worth getting clear up front, because it comes up in almost every exercise conversation. In practice, a pure cash exercise is uncommon, meaning writing a check for the full strike price out of savings and then holding all the shares. The most common transactions you'll actually see are called cashless sell and cashless hold. A cashless sell, also called a same-day sale or exercise and sell, is where the broker exercises the option and immediately sells the shares to cover the strike price and the tax withholding and delivers the remaining net proceeds to you as cash. You walk away with cash and no remaining shares. A cashless hold, sometimes called sell to cover, is where the broker just sells enough shares to cover the strike price and the tax withholding, and you keep the remaining shares. You end up holding a smaller share count than you exercise, but you didn't have to come up with the cash out of pocket. Cost basis on any shares you end up holding is the fair market value on the exercise date, the number you paid ordinary income tax on. Any appreciation or decline after that is capital gain or loss, and the clock for long-term tax treatment starts at exercise. And one last piece that matters. If you leave the company, voluntarily or not, you have a short window to exercise your vested options before they're forfeited. 90 days is common. Check your grant agreement. The 10-year expiration still exists, but the post-termination window almost always closes first. Pitfall 1 is the strategy around when to exercise. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see people make, and it's also the area where I see the worst generic financial content floating around. So here's how I actually think about it. Options have asymmetric risk. You don't participate on the downside past the strike price. If your options were granted at a $100 strike price and the stock goes down to $10, it didn't matter. You don't exercise, you lose nothing, and the options simply expire. Worst case is 0. Your downside is capped, and you didn't pay for the options in the first place. But the upside, on the other hand, is uncapped. And because you only pay the strike price instead of the market price, every dollar of appreciation creates more percentage return than if I would have owned the shares outright. That is leverage, and it's the whole reason options are a meaningful piece of executive compensation. Here's a scenario to show you what that leverage looks like. Say you have 5,000 options at a $100 strike price, and the stock is currently trading at $150. If you exercise now, your spread is $50 per share. $250,000 of ordinary income. Now, say instead you waited and the stock price ran from $150 to $200. That's a 33% move in the stock price, but your spread is now $100 per share, $500,000. A 33% move in the stock just doubled the spread. That is the leverage feature of an option, and it's exactly what you give up every time you exercise early. Pitfall 2 is the withholding gap on the spread. Same mechanics as the RSU video, quick version. That 22% federal supplemental withholding is not your tax rate. If the exercise stacks on top of meaningful salary, your actual marginal tax rate is probably higher. Let's stay with the same executive from our leverage example. 5,000 options at a $100 strike, exercising at $200 per share. Spread of $500,000. Now, add a $350,000 base salary, married filing jointly, which is a realistic picture for someone at this comp level. Total W-2 for that year comes to $850,000. That $500,000 of spread stacks on top of the salary and straddles the 24%, 32, 35, and 37% brackets under 2026 MFJ rates. When you run the actual math, the federal tax rate on the spread works out to roughly $169,000. Payroll withheld 22%, which was $110,000. So, in this example, there's a gap of about $59,000 owed at filing, just on federal, just from this one exercise. And because you chose when to exercise, you chose this gap, which means you had the ability to plan for it in advance. Pitfall 3 is letting expiration or a job change force your timing. The default for most executives is drift. No exercise plan, no target, no framework, just holding until something forces the issue. Drift is one of the most expensive exercise strategies there is. Options sit on the shelf until something makes you decide. For some people, that something is the 10-year expiration finally approaching, and now you're exercising a huge block in a single year because there's no more runway. For others, it's a job change, voluntarily or not, and suddenly the 90-day post-termination window is the calendar. In both cases, the decision is being driven by the deadline, not the plan. So what do you actually do with all this? First, know the 4 numbers on every grant cold: strike, grant size, vesting schedule, and expiration, plus the post-termination window. Every decision downstream of those depends on you knowing them. Second, understand what you actually hold. An option is a leveraged, downside-protected right to buy. That combination is rare in personal finance. Treat it accordingly. Third, and this is the one that I'd spend the most time on, match the exercise decision to your circumstances, not a rule. Stock prices are not stagnant. The price the stock is at today is not guaranteed to come back, and it's also not guaranteed to be the peak. It could run a lot higher. You can't know. What you can know is your own situation. Think about 2 very different executives. One is 55 years old, and when you look at their financial plan, they funded about 80% of what they'll need in retirement. If exercising a block of options today moves that number from 80% funded to 100% funded, why would you not do that? You've locked in the outcome you actually want, which is a fully funded retirement, even if the stock runs higher after that. The certainty matters more than the leverage. That's a good exercise. Now take a different executive, 35 years old, long runway, generally bullish on the company. Retirement is decades away, net worth is still being built. The argument for continuing to hold the options and letting the leverage work for you is a lot stronger. You can absorb the risk, you have time to recover from a bad outcome, and the upside you're chasing is real. That's a good hold. Same instrument, 2 completely different right answers. The decision is driven by the plan. When an exercise materially advances your plan, funds a goal, closes a retirement gap, reduces concentration, the leverage argument gets quieter because you've stopped needing to maximize upside and you're starting needing to lock in certainty. Fourth, compute the gap before you exercise, not after. Take the projected spread, apply your actual marginal federal tax rate for the year using the 2026 bracket table for your filing status, and compare that to the 22% federal supplemental withholding. That difference is cash you could owe at filing. Either fund it with the quarterly estimated tax payments to seek to avoid underpayment penalties, or set it aside deliberately. With NSOs, you get to pick the year. Use that. Fifth, decide which method of exercise makes the most sense for you and your goals. Cashless sell and cashless hold are 2 options you will see. A clean cash out on one end, keeping some or all of the shares on the other, but they're not the only options. Depending on your plan, a structured partial exercise across multiple years, a cash exercise funded from savings, or a combination approach can all make sense. The right choice ties right back to the circumstances conversation we just had. What are you trying to do with your proceeds, and how does that fit your broader plan? Sixth, plan around your working life. If you're considering a job change, The post-termination exercise window is one of the first things to pull up before giving notice. If you're approaching retirement, a multi-year exercise plan across your final working years can spread income across tax years and seek to avoid a forced single-year exercise of everything you still hold. Here's the through line. NSOs are leverage. That's the feature. They cap your downside at zero, give you asymmetric upside, and hand you the calendar on when to trigger the tax event. What makes them hard is that the right answer on any given exercise isn't always hold, and it isn't always exercise early. It's whatever makes sense for your plan moving forward. Sometimes that's holding and letting the leverage work. Sometimes it's exercising today to close a funding gap that actually matters in your life, like your kid's college or that new cottage you want to purchase. The executives who get the most out of NSOs are the ones who make each exercise a deliberate choice against their own circumstances. The ones who don't often find out what drift cost them in April, when the gap is already fixed and the only option left is to write a check. Next video in the series will cover incentive stock options, ISOs, which are structured completely different, show up almost exclusively at private companies, and open up a whole separate set of rules around the alternative minimum tax that trip people up in ways NSOs simply do not. If you have vested NSOs and you don't have an exercise plan, not a rule of thumb, an actual plan tied to your retirement funding in your tax picture, that conversation is still available to you. But if a job change or an expiration date forces the decision first, the calendar becomes the plan. This channel is built for high earning professionals and executives, delivering content on navigating complex financial decisions, equity compensation, tax strategy, retirement planning, and concentrated wealth. If these topics are valuable to you, be sure to subscribe so that you get more free content. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.